my generation or the younger generation, it's very easy for us to experience climate anxiety or climate despair, just feeling that, whatever action we take, it's not really going to matter. And I think, of course, from an individual point of view, that is true. And that's why we say that we need collective action.
It's actually when you engage yourself with others, it can start small, but that's what it actually quite often gives you more energy than it takes, because it also, this sense of empowerment helps you to gain energy.
We can't just depend on individual action, or we can't just depend on systematic action. It needs to be both from the supply and the demand, from the consumers and the producers.
Welcome to the third series of SystemShift, a podcast from Greenpeace which explores how we can create a better economic system that benefits both people and the planet. The theme of this series is change. Can it happen in our lifetime? My name is Schlyter and I've been your host for 2 seasons.
I'm Joycelyn. I'm an environmental justice technologist, writer and educator focusing on the connections of environmental justice. In today's episode, we are asking the question, how can I think about the planet when I can't even afford rent? We're thinking about the links with cost of living and climate action, and acknowledging that when times are hard and the cost of living is high, it's very understandable that the environment might not be front of mind. But what we come to find through our conversation is that viewing environmental concerns through the lens of social and economic justice can reveal powerful connections between your struggles and the health of our planet.
We put a poll on our Instagram page where we asked, how do socioeconomic issues affect your decisions on the climate crisis? And here is what you had to say.
I wish I could afford to shop all local produce and environmentally friendly items.
There is a lack of accessibility to really climate-friendly alternatives and healthy choices.
I have to work a 9 to 5 and I'm exhausted, so I can't really do volunteer work anymore.
I want to spend more time learning about the climate crisis, but I'm stuck thinking about the bills.
Today, we're going to be joined by a brilliant young activist, Nala Amirah, who's the founder of Green Welfare Indonesia, a youth-led NGO pioneering eco-social action through climate education, community empowerment, and nature-based solutions.
So without further ado, a warm welcome to you, Nala.
Thank you so much, Carl. Hi, and I'm very happy to be here tonight.
Hi, Nala. It'd be interesting to hear your reflections on why, even now, the climate crisis is still being viewed as an abstract, very far away, or even elitist or niche issue. And kind of reflect on also why this might be some of the roots of the issue that we're facing at the intersections of the cost of living crisis and the climate crisis.
Definitely. I think it's a really, really important question that we should be asking. I think from my 2 cents is that this concept that climate crisis is an abstract or it's, very distant to us, it's because the ones who are, stating these or feeling all of this niche in the climate crisis, because it's usually the aspiring middle class workers or either the middle class workers. We would never expect to hear the lower income classes, say that the climate crisis is being far away and that it's an elitist problem or that it's abstract, because they feel it directly. These huge chunks of population, especially in the developing countries that from where I am, from Indonesia, this aspiring middle class and the middle class as well, they have the perception of, delayed consequences. Climate change might not be felt yet, as an immediate threat, because, the worst consequences seem very far off for these people. People in this group, again, they have better access to resources. They usually have stable housing, whether it's, in a tiny cramped place, but they still have a roof over their place, like basic healthcare. And so they buffer them from the immediate impacts of the climate crisis. And the climate crisis is a slow burning phenomenon. You know, it gets affected from the lower class first, and it goes up the chain. And so I think this perception of delay is also very misleading, because at some point we all will feel the climate crisis, and it's not only going to be the lower classes that feels these. And so I think mostly for me, what I see is that there's a huge disconnect with the impacts of climate crisis. You know, people only act urgently when it becomes something that's tangible, something that you can see directly in front of your eyes. And so when the climate crisis feels removed from our daily concerns, we feel like it's a very niche and far away topic. It's when we fail to recognize, you know, the intrinsic value of ecosystems and services they provide, we can easily overlook the significance of environmental degradation.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. There's lots of really salient points there. And one thing that I resonated with was this point that those that are the most marginalized, those on the front lines, do not think it's a delayed issue because they are facing the impacts. And we know that the climate crisis is a threat multiplier. So those who are poor or marginalized or vulnerable in any way will feel the consequences of the climate crisis more strongly. We also know that those in low-income communities or living in poverty have housing standards that are subpar and are experiencing vulnerabilities in housing. We see statistics like in 15 major cities in the global south, 62% of people lack access to reliable piped water, 42% of urban populations lacking access to electricity. And I think here you were talking in your last answer about these two things, about marginalized communities and also environmental degradation. And I think this is a link that we don't make so often. Would you be able to just explain a little bit more how the issues faced by low-income communities in housing are inherently linked to those posed by environmental degradation?
Of course, when we talk about the key consequences from the climate crisis, it's not only to the environment, but also the social economic. And when we talk about social economy, it's directly to the lower communities. I think one thing that is very important to help, you know, these aspiring middle classes and middle class and the lower income for sure, is we really need to start communicating the climate crisis and information to these people very, very clearly. When these aspiring middle classes workers and blue collar workers and families, they have the urgency of meeting the basic needs first, right? They care more. For sure, they're going to be striving more for how to financially stable their household income, or when it comes to housing, or even the basic needs of foods. And so if we really want to make the integration of sustainability while they're trying to, you know, fight for more basic needs within their lives, I think one more thing is to give lots of incentives to these people, because they need upfront incentives of sustainability, making sustainability affordable for them, because they don't have the luxury of making large upfront investments without immediate financial support. You know, it could be something that's very simple that I see here in Japan. One of the examples is like grocery store promotions. So I see a lot of like, especially farmer markets here, they give incentives for, you know, buying organic or sustainably sourced products. So, you know, for example, there are seasonal campaigns here where, you know, customers who purchase a certain amount of organic produce, they receive a discount on their next purchase. Or especially like, let's say, utility companies, they can also include informational inserts in their energy bills. So just a bit of like an informational sheet of, you know, how much you would save when you turn off the electricity, as well as, you know, an insert that might explain maybe a program where if they purchase energy efficient appliances or they install smart thermostats or cooling. And so they, you know, directly offering sustainable, affordable options to their basic needs and just integrating it and making lots of incentives. And this is where both the government and businesses have a really, really crucial role in giving this information, providing the necessary information. And I think going back to just the housing crisis and the living crisis, it's not only being impacted only to the lower communities now. Japan is having a really huge inflation rate. I think the inflation rate reached around 4% just in 2024. Everything is much more expensive, from electricity, food, as well as transportation. And it's public transportation that's becoming more expensive. And this is undeniably connected directly to the climate crisis from energy prices, because Japan imports a lot of energy and imports a lot of food. So undeniably, when inflation hits, everything's going to be much more expensive.
I think it's interesting when you talk about linking social sustainability and how you promote more eco-friendly living. Like, if the government support EV purchases or investments in housing, it's the rich who is going to have the capacity to use that. But it's not them who spend the largest share of their income on housing. When you do that, you can't afford energy efficiency. You can't afford to do investment that you know are good for you. And that's exactly the same group that feels the first pressure of inflation and cost increases. So the people who feel the brunt of the inflation and the people who feel the brunt of the daily cost crisis are also the same people who have the least capacity to invest themselves out of the problem by themselves. And therefore, the government needs to step in. And I think it's interesting that you're only 15 when you took part of the initiative to do the green environment movement in Indonesia. And I wonder, when you did this at such a young age, did you think about the social link to sustainability issues? Was that part of what made you want to start this movement, or was it other things?
Yeah, I think I started in the climate movement just as the pandemic was swayed in. So most of the activism that I did back then was digitally. But one thing that really made my awareness or what I realized, especially from the people around me, was back again, like what I said earlier, the lack of information about the climate crisis to really, really make people have the urgency to actually, take action. And everyone back in 2020, at least within my circle, because I think in the Indonesian or like the Asia climate movement back then, even though it was only 4 years ago, it was definitely not as big as the Western climate movement, especially when Greta started. The climate crisis in Indonesia back then was just only seen as a very niche job or field. Mostly we saw sustainability as, like a role that needs to be taken by academicians, like researchers, or on a professional level, and not really necessarily young people. And so I think from there, everyone didn't really know the cost of inaction. And I realized that. And so that's kind of what sparked and tingled me to really start. They didn't know the cost of inaction, how that cost will affect them socially and economically in the future.
I think it's really amazing to have highlighted those kind of gaps in your community and tried to plug them. And I think what you've built is a wide community. You've impacted so many people, and part of your work is going into communities as well. So not just, building an activist group, but actually trying to interact with people, meet them at their level, and also service needs that are inherently connected to people's ability to survive and to sustain themselves whilst doing this education work on environmental justice and on sustainability. And I think one of the big things that people feel that they can't take climate action, apart from this kind of resource issue of, I can't pay my rent, or I have all of these cost of living crises, is just feeling that the problem is too large to do on their own and feeling quite isolated with action. And what you've done is the complete opposite. You're hitting all of these different things on the head: the community action, the services, the housing needs, I would love to hear some of your reflection on collective action and how we move from this place of whether feeling things are too far away or the problems are too big to actually meeting really specific needs, educating on these needs and making change in a collective manner.
Yeah, I think my generation or the younger generation, it's very easy for us to experience climate anxiety or climate despair, just feeling that, whatever action we take, it's not really going to matter. And I think, of course, from an individual point of view, that is true. And that's why we say that we need collective action, of course, rather than individual action. But in a sense, individual action needs to also, parallelly, it needs to go at the same time with systematic action. So we can't just depend on individual action, or we can't just depend on systematic action. It needs to be both from the supply and the demand, from the consumers and the producers. And so I think one thing that I try to change the narrative, or what I see that usually, that we try to do when it comes to climate action, is that we have the wrong goal of executing or doing climate action in the first place. A lot of people usually see that climate action, they don't see the bigger picture. They only see the direct, immediate, or measurable impact. Let's say reducing your meat consumption, for example, reducing your carbon footprint from transportation. Of course, that's super important. But if we only focus on, these little lifestyle changes without looking or adding more value to it by putting it as a collective demand for climate action, of course, we're going to feel despair because we can't really see the impacts directly. And I think one of the goals that we need to try to shift ourselves towards is not, the goal of climate action is not about counting, the carbon footprint that we emit or on a personal level. It's more of creating a collective demand to the government, to the companies, to push out these old systems and create a new system. I think I learned this in one of my environmental economics class, creative disruption. It's the destruction of the old to create spaces for the creative growth of the new. So in order for us to create new systems, we need to push back the outdated systems that are unsustainable for this current life path. And that takes a lot of transition. It takes a lot of change. It takes a lot of shocks culturally and economically and socially, for sure, for everyone. But it's that transition period where we need to mainstream and normalize the new way of living that has much more quality and that's much more sustainable. And I think it's so important for us to also realize the bigger picture of community collective actions.
I think it's interesting because you mentioned the creative destruction, and it has traditionally also been used by the neoliberals and the ultra-capitalists when they want to change the world in their direction. Now what you're saying is that using community is that the next rebuild is going to be for the common good, not the individual greed. And you talk about the importance of building communities, and that's actually what you have been doing concretely. So I'm wondering, what can we learn from your Indonesian initiative when it comes to making people engage, and who is engaged? Is it aspiring middle class? Is it the already middle class or upper middle class? And which groups? Do you bring all ethnic groups and so on? What can we learn from your experience here?
Yeah, I think so. From my movement in Indonesia, Green Welfare, we have a very diverse background of young people. Mostly we target around for 15 to 25-year-olds to be involved in our movement. And from Green Welfare itself, we focus on environmental education on informal schools. So both informal schools and also in indirect and informal learning settings. What's very, very interesting about Green Welfare, even though we don't directly have any specific requirements for you to join Green Welfare, but the ones who usually register to volunteer in Green Welfare are actually high school students and young girls. So we have a program where we create climate change education textbooks that will be used for informal learning in schools in the co-curricular subjects. And from that, we have around 22 young girls that are being involved directly creating the textbooks. And then we have the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Environment, as well as teachers who cross-checks that what is being created by these girls are relevant, are credible. And so we also have that intergenerational collaboration in Green Welfare. Even though the young people are executing it, we want to get the wisdom and the knowledge from the generations before us, because that's really important, with the generations before teaching us, lessons learned. And I think for me personally, from my experience from Green Welfare, it's definitely very important to, create programs that give benefits to the community, like the beneficiaries. But it's also very important to think about the upscaling and the upskilling of your volunteers. So what we try to do in Green Welfare is that we try to get them directly involved in learning soft skills and technical skills and green skills. So for example, for our climate education program, not only are they creating the necessary information for these school students, but they're also learning how to create climate curriculums. So they are equipped with the end-to-end knowledge and skills to become, future environmental leaders, but also to give impact directly to the society that they want to contribute to. I think that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I
think it's more than 2 cents.
Yeah, it's more than that. It's really beautiful. It's really beautiful to hear, and it's really interesting to also hear you speak about intergenerational collaboration. And one thing that we need as communities with, increasing environmental degradation is resilience. Communities that work together, and especially communities that work together across this kind of generational bound, are more resilient. And I think I have 2 questions here. One is, how have you seen that community action has made the communities that you work with more resilient? What are some of these risks that are able to be easier weathered by working together?
The benefits that they get from preserving the environment, it's priceless. One thing that we need to focus on for especially communities is to understand that once communities actually take positive advantage of the environment and reduce as much as negative impacts on it, we create a community that's super, super independent and that can thrive by its own. So I had a recent experience of directly being involved in the end-to-end process of an organic farm here in a rural city in Japan, in Oita. And they create their own rice. They have their own paddy fields. They do organic farming, so no pesticides used at all. And one thing that I see from all of the communities there, from also like socially and as well as just psychologically, is that I can see just how healthy they are. Maybe the average was around 60 to 70 age farmers, and they were still working on field, where they had to, they had to harvest from 8 to 12 p.m. every day. And it was for me, it was super tiring as my first experience. And then when I saw, one of the farmers who has been doing this his whole life and he's never complained, I was just like, okay, my generation needs to start really, really, really understanding what it's like out there, cause we're always just inside the classroom nowadays. We don't really go out and, the professors, what we learn in school is mostly just theories. We don't really actually know how hard it is to produce our own food, to produce our own energy. So I think once a community knows how to provide those basic needs, from energy to food, and some communities also know how to build their own homes from scratch using the natural resources, you become independent, and you're not scared of economic shocks because you already know how to produce the primary needs that your families need to survive on a day-to-day.
And how does this community approach to action reimagine the myth that, in order to take environmental action, you have to be a perfect environmentalist? How does community action move us away from this idea that as an individual, you have to be a perfect environmental kind of activist, but someone that's part of a community building this community resilience?
A lot of young people who didn't really understand what the climate crisis was, they used to call me out for that. So let's say I used to go to school using my own car, and they would say, "You're an environmentalist. Why are you not using public transportation?" There were times where I, as a human, forgot my water bottle at home. So I had to buy a plastic bottle. And so that one time I used a plastic bottle, they were like, "You're an environmentalist. Why are you using a plastic?"
No, we'll
water?
take you off this podcast immediately.
And so it was that one time that I used a plastic bottle because of my human error of forgetting my water bottle. And so I got called out for all of those. And so I think there isn't a perfect environmentalist in the world. Even just as small as this mic had to be transported from all the way from Osaka to where I live, and the emissions from shipping itself, it's already creating a certain emission that we're already creating emission from that. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's what we need to try to do is not focus on these specific individual things, but look at the broader systems that has facilitated this kind of system in the first place, because perfect environmentalism doesn't exist.
Well, thank you so much, Nala, for being with us today. We've covered so much ground, and I think our listeners would be really interested in your answers. So keep on doing the amazing work that you're doing, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much.
Well, that was such an interesting conversation. It was great to hear about Nala's work and really this focus on community action. I know that we spent a lot of time on that. And I think for me, this is one of the best levers to move past this idea that those who are the most vulnerable don't have a space to kind of care about the environmental crisis. Like, we kind of see in this conversation that that's a myth, and that they're the most impacted by these issues, but that also approaching vulnerabilities through a community lens allows us to become empowered and to become more resilient, rather than as an extra burden or sacrifice that we need to make in terms of taking out environmental action. I think that was a really important reflection to bring to the fore.
Yeah, and I was also inspired by her talk about the community of villagers in Japan and how they work together, how that gives you energy and doesn't take energy. Mm-hmm. Because quite often I meet people that are struggling just to get by, and mm-hmm. then you don't have the energy to do collective action or fight the system or whatever that's needed. But I think her example and many others around the world show that it's actually when you engage yourself with others, it can start small, but that's what it actually quite often gives you more energy than it takes, because it also, this sense of empowerment helps you to gain energy.
Yeah, and I think that this kind of like energy transfer also comes from the fact that working as communities for a general environmental justice agenda, but one that is intersectional, means that you actually can get through life easier in terms of mutual aid, supporting each other, picking up the slack where some people are lacking, or where you have strengths, bringing those in, and kind of having more of an ecosystem, which means that instead of having to worry about your food, your energy, all of these issues and vulnerabilities, some of that burden can be carried by the community, and also you can lighten that burden for others where you have capacity. I think I see this a lot in groups where the climate isn't necessarily the core agenda, but the action is being taken under this kind of environmental justice framework. One really important example is that of Hazel M. Johnson, who's one of the mothers of environmental justice. And her work was really about housing. She found out that her community's kind of estate was located on top of a toxic waste site. And she found this out because sadly her husband had passed away from cancer very, very early on. And lots of members of her community, which was a primarily Black community, were suffering lots of different ailments. And so already we have a low income community suffering exasperated health impacts. And without an environmental justice kind of framework, you might think, well, that's got everything to do with economics. But when you kind of take this broader idea of environmental justice, you see that this community is being more kind of strongly impacted by overconsumption, by polluting industries, by toxic industries. So she founded the People for Community Recovery, which really focused on this intersection of housing, terrible housing that people were experiencing in Chicago, where she lived, and this wider issue of environmental justice. So I think that's a really good example of where projects that are motivated by some of these other issues that are faced by low-income communities become an environmental justice campaign and provide better outcomes, better living standards for communities.
I totally agree. That's crucially important. I experienced this firsthand when I did my final thesis, and I did it in a favela in Brazil, an extremely poor community there. And you could see that the current economic system just pushes environmental problems to the weakest group that can't defend themselves. So you mentioned Black communities in the US. It's quite clear that they are more exposed to lead poisoning from different sources. And it's the same all over the place. It doesn't matter if you're in Europe or in the US or in the global South, like Swedish mining companies put their toxic waste in communities in South America that couldn't defend themselves. So this is going through everywhere. It's the same story. And if you don't have the capacity to build communities and empower people, we are never going to solve environmental problems. We are always going to move them to people who can't defend themselves and communities that can't defend themselves. So it's really important, this.
You're right. This is happening kind of in all countries, all across the world. It's not just a global South, global North problem. And I think this is why it's something that we need to become intimately more aware of, this kind of social justice approach, because it's happening to the most marginalized communities everywhere, even in high income countries. In the UK, for example, Black communities, regardless of income level, are more likely to be living in areas of high air pollution. It's those who are on the front lines, as you said, who are facing the worst impacts, but also who are the least responsible. And it's our kind of responsibility as those who live with relative safety, relative security, to engage in with those communities, and to be kind of allies and to better educate ourselves on these intersections. The examples of where this is done right are so important as well. The examples of where communities, regardless of income, have a base level quality of life and environmental experience is so important, and important for kind of being able to feel like you have agency in taking action against these issues. Because I think that's a big thing.
And it shows the importance of like keeping more than one thought in mind at the same time. Like it's easy to say, okay, we have a lack of housing in this city. Let's build here close to this highway because that's where there's some free land. But that's going to be severely noise polluted, and people there are going to have more diseases. Like only think about, okay, we need to solve the housing now, and you put them in places where people are going to feel sick and not being able to get energy enough to defend themselves, then you're worse off. You're going to create new places where people are going to suffer. So integrating environmental and sustainable concerns in social housing and in social issues is crucial. Otherwise, we are not going to win the battle against neither climate nor social exclusion.
No, and I mean, this is such an important part of the conversation around house building, because one, you're right, we don't have enough houses and people need more housing. But two, the rush for putting up very shoddy housing made of incredibly unsustainable materials, made in ways that are not conducive to a good quality of life, just expose those communities further to risk. When communities are hit by floods or when they're hit by heat waves, those buildings are not going to provide the safety for those communities to live properly. And so you're right, keeping these two things in mind is so important, because whatever the outcome, it's those who are the most vulnerable that will be impacted the most, whilst people are profiting off of these, new build situations.
And that's where Nala gave me some hope, because showing that community organizing is and creating this counter movement of people who do things together can prevent us from repeating those mistakes again and again. So that feels inspiring, I think.
And this is where the education piece comes in, because so many of us, are just trying to get by and don't have, the time, or feel like we don't have the time to engage in these issues. But it's kind of a benefit to those systems of oppression that we don't know a lot. It's a benefit that we don't see how these systems are interlinked. It benefits them that we don't push together, or we don't come together to actually say, hold on a minute, this isn't good enough, or hold on a minute, actually housing is tied to the environmental crisis and you're not providing us with the quality of life that's important. And so education and access to information becomes a really big lever in changing systems.
And for those of you new to this podcast, we actually have 2 earlier seasons where we went through a lot of the economic root causes of problems. For example, that across the globe, housing has become increasingly unaffordable. In most places of the world, especially in Southeast Asia and Asia, you have 6 years of income to buy a house. It's extremely unaffordable when it's above 5. And every continent is now above 5 except Africa. So we can see here this extreme unaffordability for housing is not by coincidence. It's by the banking system and the financial system. Like across the globe, housing prices have increased 75% more than income. So for the last 22 years. So you can see that the root causes and the financial system that creates these social problems and these environmental problems are also in this sector, when we talk about housing, extremely negative, impacting people's general daily lives and their possibility to afford decent housing. So if you want to study more the root causes of economic foundations, then I can recommend some of the episodes also from the earlier 2 seasons.
Well, it's been such an expansive session. And I think one lesson that I'm leaving with today is just how much kind of hope there is in community. It can be very overwhelming to contemplate the environmental crisis alongside these socioeconomic pressures that we've been talking about and that we all face day to day. But what we've learned is that there's so many things that we can do, and how these things make the smallest difference on a global scale, but also make a huge difference on our kind of day-to-day lives on a local level. Carl, you were just mentioning some of the past episodes that people can listen to learn more on this topic. Do you have some other resources that people can dive into to educate themselves better?
For sure. For example, on the Greenpeace International homepage, greenpeace.org, we have several blog posts exploring climate and social crises and what you can do about that and how you can achieve transformative action and so on. So I think there you can get some inspiration for what you can do and what you could do with others and how you can influence your politicians.
Amazing. And we've spoken so much about community today. There are the obvious actions like trying to find out about local initiatives and events that are climate related, environmentally related, really getting into the projects and initiatives that are happening in your local community. But one thing that I find that's kind of often overlooked is actually just speaking with your neighbors. I mean, how many of us really know our neighbors? Do we know our neighbors' names? These are the people that we kind of live very intimately with. And so this could be a really interesting and novel first step, as well as all of the other actions. But knocking on next door's door and saying, hey, do you want to talk about these issues that are happening in our community? I think that, I'd be interested to see how some of those conversations go.
Yeah, that's funny you say that, because I live in Sweden where speaking with somebody that you don't know is kind of a scary thing. to do.
Scary, 100%.
But I think you're right. I mean, to find it too scary of a step to meet people in person. There are many online initiatives and many groups you could go where you would feel safe and meet other people. So I think that's a good tip, to communicate with your peers.
Even a WhatsApp group, a little note through the letterbox. Yeah, there are so many ways. It doesn't have to just be in person.
Yeah, we'll just mention the platforms where young people would feel comfortable. Sure. I mean, but that's true. Do you feel that things are unsurmountable, difficult to change? That's actually not the right feeling to have, because we have so many examples in history where things were considered to be completely impossible, and just a few weeks later, things change. And remember this, when a thought is starting to spread to society, that you can topple an old power structure, it can spread so much quicker than you think. And if you, together with your community and friends, you start this process and you feel empowered, others will as well. And this spread can change things much more rapidly than we think. And we often think about, so big economic investments and infrastructure and technological solutions. The good thing with social change is it can go so much more rapid.
Yeah, thank you. I really believe the same thing. I always think to my ancestors, and I think to people like Nala who are doing this work, you know, by taking this apathetic approach, we neglect the work that people are doing that is making change every single day and on various different levels. And I find that incredibly hopeful. So can change happen in our lifetime? I think it already is.
Bye, until next time.
See you next time.